recording, and so we will send the recording out afterwards also, so that you all have it. So introduction. So I'm Kristen McTaggart. I'm the Freedom from Violence Project Director at the Women's Fund. And we'll talk to you today about kind of what we anticipate our priorities will be for policy in 2022. And then I'm going to let Angie introduce herself.
Hello, friends. My name is Angie Lordson, and I currently sit on the board of directors for Survivors Rising. I am the treasurer, but I'm also the chair of the Policy and Legislative Committee, and I've been that title for the last 4 years, and I believe I'm going into my 5th session this January. So thanks for coming on.
Perfect. So we are going to be your facilitators for today. We're going to sort of just jump right in. But again, I want to thank everybody for being here. I was thinking about our recent luncheon, and Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, spoke. And one of the things that she said at our Lead the Change event is that, we can't end sexual violence until we interrupt sexual violence, and that courage will move us farther and wider than fear does. And so I appreciate you just engaging with us around how we interrupt sexual violence, and in particular, how we do that through our policy work. So the first thing I just want to chat about is, really kind of going through what some of our anticipated priorities are. Since we are in the second year of our 2-year legislative cycle, this is a short session, but we do have a couple bills that are still in committee from last year. And so those will continue to be priorities for us this year. LB 118 is one of our bills that we prioritized, or that we worked on last year. That is a protection order bill that expands access to protection orders. So it does primarily 2 things. It extends the duration of them. Right now, they're good for a year, and this would extend it to 5 years, so that survivors aren't constantly having to request a renewal. And then the other piece of that is that it removes the notarization requirement. In particular, during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of access issues around survivors being able to find a notary to get to the courthouse. The courthouse was closed for periods of time during the pandemic. All of those things. It's just one more barrier to ensuring that folks can get the protection that they need when they need it. So it would replace the notarization requirement with just a signed sworn statement. So those are the 2 primary changes. Again, it was heard in the Judiciary Committee. It's still there. It hasn't been voted out of the committee yet. Some of the challenges around it are that 5 years tends to feel a little long for some people, in particular because there are some firearm restrictions that are attached to individuals that have an active protection order. And so we face some challenges around that, just around restricting access to firearms. People feel different ways about that. But we do feel like there's some room to compromise around still raising it past a year, and providing options, even if we have to lower it from 5 years. So Angie, I know you also worked on that bill, so I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, so as a survivor and working with Survivors Rising, the biggest thing that our group really does is bring the survivor voice to legislative policy. And so when it comes to LB 118, I was able to help tell my story through letter writing during the hearing process, and also through the press conference that Women's Fund helped with Senator Moorfield. So part of my story was not having the knowledge that a protection order only lasted 1 year. As a victim of childhood sexual assault, my abuser was my father. And so we had to leave in the middle of the night and get ourselves to safety. And once we moved back into the home, he started to stalk us. And so he started living in the field next to our home. We lived out in the country. And so my mother got a protection order at that time. And so that it provided that level of security that in your mind, because it doesn't necessarily stop you, but it's a legal justification that they should not be interacting with you. And so I just had that assumption. Granted, I was still 14, 15 at this time, didn't really know or understand everything. And everything was kind of left up to my mother in order to be an advocate for us. And when I got a job, I was 16, I was working, and he came into the place that I worked. And I was completely petrified. And I had people walk me out to my car because I didn't know what he had done to my car. And so it was just one of those, I hadn't seen him in a year or two, or since all of this had happened. And so it was very traumatizing to me, very triggering to me that he just showed up at my place of work. And so when I got to my mother and I'm like, you cannot believe this, I know that there's a protection order. And she was like, actually, that actually expired. And not really understanding that they expire, which in my brain, I was like, I would be happy with a lifetime protection order. I am now 46. It's been over 30 years since I've had contact with him. I would be okay with a lifetime protection order. Um, and there are, when I was doing research pertaining to this bill, there's many different states that have higher time frames and limits. And so asking for 5 years is not out of the realm, because every time that a survivor has to go back and re-up their protection order, a notification is sent off to their abuser, and it just reopens that wound again. And so it's just one of those things that if whatever we can do to try to lengthen that, or at least provide information on how you can reinstate a protection order, all of that would be beneficial. Currently, we don't have any of those safeguards here. They just expire with no notification. And so it's up to the survivor to remember to go get it renewed. So anything with this bill, I'm super passionate about. And as we go on through communications, I'm an open book. So please, if you have any questions about survivors and how survivors work, we'll talk about that a little bit further. But Kristen, I'll hand it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. And I always appreciate that like super real lens about why protection orders are so important and why people use them. I think that one of the things that we hear a lot, whether it's from senators or whether it's just sort of the narrative that's out there, is that there's this idea that protection orders are pursued really frivolously and they're used to retaliate because of custody issues or divorce or things, and that people don't really need them. And I would tell you just that I hear your story and I hear so many other stories from survivors, and that's I won't say people don't ever abuse the system, because I don't think that's real. It's just not the norm. I mean, I think what's more the norm is people need them and often can't get them. So, we, some of I mentioned the gun rights and access. We also know that the Bar Association testified against this. And I think some of that, again, comes from that kind of idea of protection orders being retaliatory or frivolous and not really needed. So that's one that we're looking to continue to work on and hope that we can move forward. The next bill that I wanted to chat about from last session that is also still in committee is LB7. That is Senator Blood's bill. It's referred to as a Good Samaritan bill. It's primarily around sexual violence and trafficking and provides protection from arrest and charges when an individual is attempting to access medical care for violence against them, or when they are attempting to report violence against them or violence against somebody else. There's a similar bill that was also introduced is Senator Moorfield bill, LB 519, that's also still in committee. That one's really specific, more around sexual violence, and I think was really geared towards young people, in particular college students, high school, who aren't reporting sexual violence that happened to them or that maybe happened to someone they know, because they're concerned about retaliation because maybe they were drinking and they're underage or something like that. And so that bill's specific to that. So there may be some work around how can we combine different pieces of both of those and create something that has some support to move forward. So that's the other bill from last session. So then I want to talk a little bit about some of our anticipated priorities for new bills and what we think may come this upcoming session. So one of the issues that we are working on is around collections protection. And that would really, we've done a lot of work around access to medical care and support for costs around medical care for survivors, victims of violence, in particular, domestic sexual trafficking and also child abuse. So the Sexual Assault Payment Program provides direct medical reimbursement for forensic exams. And then enhancements to the Crime Victims Reparation Program allows for medical providers to bill directly for certain additional medical costs that a survivor might incur from injuries that were sustained, for sexually transmitted infection, preventative medication, emergency contraception, those sorts of things. So this would continue to enhance some of that and would really prevent survivors from being sent to collections. Because even with those programs, we do know that survivors often get bills for injuries that occurred because of harm or violence that was perpetrated against them. And so we know that there may be concerns from some folks in the healthcare system, in particular for perhaps smaller agencies, things like that, that can't always absorb those costs. So we anticipate that we'll work closely with medical providers to figure out what's doable and what feels manageable. But the goal again is to continue to both enhance access to medical care for survivors and also prevent them from getting giant bills and getting sent to collections for things that were done to them. And then the next piece that we are also looking at is a domestic abuse fatality review. We actually have had a few families of homicide victims, individuals that were killed by their partner, that have reached out to us and have been having some conversations with us for a while, wanting to play a part in some sort of policy that could prevent what happened to their sister, mother, daughter, all of the things, prevent what happened to them in the future. And so what's come from that is the idea of a domestic abuse fatality review. A lot of other states have this. In fact, like 43 or 44 other states have a domestic abuse fatality review team. Nebraska has kind of an informal process for looking at those, but there's no statutory support for it at this point. So without statutory support, things like access to confidential information that law enforcement may have about investigations and stuff like that, like there's no support for a team to access that in a confidential way to review and then to analyze factors that may have contributed, whether those are system factors, whether they're outside the system factors, and then to make recommendations around what agency policy change would look like, what state policy change would look like, what legislation would look like, all of those things. So there's some really good models out there from other states. Again, a lot of folks have been doing this for a long time, so we don't have to completely invent it. There's some, again, good things out there already. So that's concerns for around that could come on costs, just because there will probably need to be a fiscal note for somebody to help coordinate and be the holder of some of that information. Even things like it would create a team that would be the team to review those and create recommendations. So what a transportation costs look like for reimbursement, things like that. So so both of those are things that we're looking at. We are having some conversations with senators. We believe that we have interest in both of those. And so again, we'll have more information about that coming as we get a little bit closer to session. Angie, did you have anything that you wanted to add to either of those?
Well, for the collections piece of it, I think we've all been into the hospital for something, where we're not feeling well. Well, let's run an additional test. For me, because of my healthcare situation, I would think twice, like, how can I afford this? Who's paying for this? That kind of thing. And so, if we can take away some of those barriers and get the communication out for those sexual assault, domestic violence victims, when they do appear at the hospital, that if they need to run an MRI, if they need to run a CAT scan, that those services, those tests would be covered, because those sounds like really big words and they cost, and it sounds like it costs a lot of money, but those are things that would help in the bring the perpetrator to justice, is if we have all the information of all the everything that happened during that circumstance. So any barrier that we can eliminate in order for survivors to come forward, both of these would help with that. For the fatality review, it just makes sense to make sure that we have something here in the state and bring us in line with the other states.
Perfect. So the last thing that I want to talk about as far as priorities is sexual violence prevention. Many of you know that we did a lot of work around the Nebraska Department of Education health standards, because they really had a pretty strong sexual violence prevention lens and pieces of it, and also had a lot of other things that really intersect in sexual violence prevention. So we've really taken a position based on 3 decades of really incredible research that we know that sexual violence prevention, healthy relationships, sex education, all of those things are really one and the same. They all go hand in hand. And so even though those health education standards that we've worked on through spring and summer have been paused with indefinitely, essentially paused, and we don't know if or when those will come back up. We also know that there is potentially some prevention education that is likely to come up this session. It may look like a pushback or providing restrictions on any sort of comprehensive sex education that can be taught, which again, that includes sexual violence prevention and healthy relationship pieces. So, that would be concerning for us. There is a prevention bill that's out there. It's actually on select file from last session. LB 281 is Senator Albrecht's bill. It's, we didn't take a formal position on that. They're mainly around thoughts around quality control. It really essentially charges each district with implementing their own education program. And we would love to see something that really effectively provided standards that could be a little uniform across the state, like something through NDE. But that is out there. It is on select file. We don't know if it will go anywhere. Senator Albrecht was also pretty vocal around the opposition to some of the NDE standards. So I don't know if that will move or not move, or if we'll see other stuff come up this session, but it is still a priority for us, and we'll continue to work on this because it's really key if we want to end gender-based violence in our communities. Then we have to have a focus on prevention. So that's really kind of a summary of what our priorities are for next session. The other thing that we really wanted to spend some time with, though, is just in talking about what advocacy or support looks like around those issues. We do and will always engage individuals that have lived experience in those discussions, so that individuals with lived experience really guide all of our work, so that we know that we're on track, that we're representing all of the voices that need to be represented. And we work closely with Angie and Survivors Rising, along with a number of other folks. But I wanted to let Angie talk a little bit about kind of what her work has looked like, and also why having that lived experience and survivor engagement is so important, and some additional things to think about if that's something you identify with and want to step into that space, or for that matter, if you're working with other survivors that want to step into that space.
Thank you, Kristen. So like I said earlier, I started in this work about 5 years ago. I attended Senator Blood had a town hall type in Bellevue where she was talking about sex trafficking in the state of Nebraska. And it really introduced that topic to me. But while I was sitting there listening to the panelists, and I was overwhelmed with I'm ready to tell my story. Like, I have a story to tell, and I think it's time that I start actually doing work and advocating for survivors of childhood sexual assault. And so then I started reaching out to Women's Fund, or actually I had reached out to the AG's office. I had talked to Gene. He had put me in contact with the coalition. And then through that, I got onto some other boards and committees and asked to join some meetings. And then I was told about Survivors Rising. And so I became a board member there and really started working through with Survivors Rising of what advocacy really looks like. And so Women's Fund was reaching out to us, hey, do we have a survivor voice that fits this criteria? And if so, would you like to participate? So one of the very first bills that I actually worked on was for Senator Crawford. She had a sick and safe leave bill, and this has been going on for years, but she first introduced it where I could testify back 4 years ago, I believe. So we're friends, Senator Crawford and I. And so I really felt like my voice is going to be super impactful, right? I wrote up this big letter. I told about how we had to leave in the middle of the night. My mom dropped us off at a friend's house so that we could walk to school. And my mother had to go to work. She worked at Conagra Foods at the time. And so she was like, I'm going to be day one, I'm a single mom. I need to continue. I don't want to lose my job. So we ended up going to school that day. My mother was at work. It was also my brother's birthday. And when they started singing happy birthday to him in his homeroom, he started crying. And so his teacher pulled him out and said, what's going on? And he told her the story, how we had packed up in the middle of the night, had ran off to grandma and grandpa's house. And she was like, hold up. And so then they pulled me out of my class and said, hey, is this true? Did this happen? And I was like, oh, this totally happened. And so they stuck us in different rooms. That's when social services was brought in. That's when the sheriff's department was brought in. And, when the social worker got there, she was like, so does your dad have any weapons or any guns? Is he going to be pretty upset that you left? And I was like, oh yeah, he's going to be pretty upset. And yes, he does own firearms. So the school went on lockdown. And so this is 30 years ago. So lockdown looked like teachers eating their lunch at a door because you can't lock the door. So it was just a very interesting time to live and be in that kind of situation. And so that was the story that I went and I told during the hearing. And I'm like, this is an impactful story. Like, we have to be able to get the story across. So, I write this letter, I do my 12 copies. I get told that my knight in shining armor, Robert with the coalition, was going to be there outside the hearing room. And he would walk me through the whole process of, you have to fill out this sheet, and then you have to hand this sheet in and make sure you have your 12 copies. And this is where you sit. And then you have to say your name and then spell it out. And then probably back then we had 5 minutes for hearing to testify. Now in the last couple of years, it's been more like 3 minutes. So you have to get this whole story into like 3 minutes. And so I get done and I was the last testifier for the proponent piece. And I'm like, I nailed it. Went back, sat in the seat, and they pulled up anybody that was in opposition. And I was like, who would oppose this? Like, I just told my story. And it was impactful, and everyone should, this is a good thing for our state. And a line of people got up to oppose my bill. And I just sat there and I was dumbfounded and I was hurt and I was crushed. And it was like, didn't they hear me? Like, why are they speaking out in opposition? So I felt very naive about the whole process. And I started getting messages. I got a message from somebody that said, hey, your story was super impactful. Thank you so much. Senators were actually stopped what they were doing, and they looked up and they watched you and they listened. They heard you while you were testifying. And then I was like, wait, who's this message? I don't know who this is. And it was like somebody that was watching over the camera. And I was like, wait, there's people, like, I forget, your first time testifying, there's just so much. So I walked out of there and I was shook, and it was very triggering, and it was just very overwhelming. And I knew I had a ton of support. I had Robert with me. There was other allies in the room, but I also felt like I wasn't prepared. I didn't know enough. So one of the things that we've done over the years, and it took us a year and a half or so, but there was a lot of people that came together to kind of write this manual for survivors and what to expect when you're going to the Capitol to try to testify on any bill. So we talk about where the bathrooms are located at, where some of the hearing rooms are located at. We talk through the process, how many copies of your testimony to take, the different conversations that you need to have ahead of time. In the last session, I was coaching survivors before they would go down there. I would talk about the adrenaline dump that happens to your body and what happens when you get put into those high stress situations, and talk them through different things. We talk about having someone, a friend to call when you leave the Capitol. So when you're walking back to your car and on your way home, what's your mental health, what's your self-care plan for after you testify? Because it can be very triggering and it can be really hard, but boy, is it totally worth it. So a couple of years ago, I helped Senator Kate Bowles with LB 43. And so we worked hand in hand with the Women's Fund and other coalitions across the state. It was the advocacy bill for the Survivors' Bill of Rights. And so I was asked to come down to the Capitol, and I actually sat in on a negotiation meeting with an opponent to this bill. And so what my role there was to talk about the difference between the word survivor and the word victim. And so what we had learned back then was that victim is actually a word that's currently in state statute. So while some people are okay with having that terminology in state statute, it's already there, where survivor is not. And they don't want to add survivor to the state statute. So during that negotiation process, part of my role was to talk through why it's important to tell the difference between a victim and a survivor. And so even though we went through that whole process, we still had to do some negotiating, because in the end, it was all about getting that bill across the finish line. And as Tiffany always says, it's how the sausage gets made. There's a lot of give and take throughout this whole process. And so during those times and during some of the conversations I was having with different senators and being able to create those relationships and tell the story of being a survivor and the impact if we are not involved in policy. Because I'll tell you first thing is there's a lot of lobbyists that are down in Lincoln, and they're pulling senators out onto the floor, out into the rotunda, having conversations with them, but they're paid to be there. Lobbyists are paid to be there. Who's not paid to be there are survivors with our lived experience, telling the stories. So when I talk about my story and how we didn't have an advocate through the whole judicial process. My father was arrested, but he was let out on bail within a couple of days, and they made us go through mediation. They made me sit in a room with him. I had severe anxiety, and my mother was just like, I can't put her through a trial. I can't do that. And so we actually no one ever carried on charges against my dad. He was never labeled as a pedophile. And so what happened was he then went on to abuse other teenage girls. And I know of at least 2, maybe 3 within Sarpy County that he abused. So that's some of the ramifications if we don't have the advocacy piece, if we can't walk survivors through the process in order to bring those perpetrators to justice. So when LB 43 hit the floor, we had some senators that were speaking out against it, mostly due to circumstances in their districts. And whether there was representation or an advocate, how would an advocate get to those survivors in those districts? And so I was able to pull them off the floor and be like, hey, listen, let's talk about this. Here's what's happening in your district. Let's talk particularly about that. And instead of those senators voting no on that bill on first reading, we actually got them to be a no vote, or they didn't vote at all. And so it created an avenue when you are taking bills from general reading onto select file and then onto final reading. It helps on that voting process to not have them vote no on those bills. And so it's incredibly important to be able to have survivors in those circumstances and down there to get in their face, frankly, and be like, no, this is why this bill is so important. Our stories matter, and they drive the policy work that all of the coalitions, women's funds included, Survivor's Voice provides that avenue to create the policy. And so some of the initiatives are because survivors are coming forward to say, here's the hiccup that we have within our system currently, and this is a statutory thing that we need help with. And so senators are constantly coming to survivors. They're constantly coming to the different coalitions and saying, what do you have? I would love to bring a bill to help support domestic violence survivors rising. How can we help? And what bills are we needing to create? What tweaks do we need to make to current statute in order to make sure that the survivor voice is recognized and it is heard? So if you know of anyone, if you would like to help, Survivors Rising is here to support all survivors of violence. And so if you, I would always encourage you to reach out to us. We'd love to be able to work with you or anyone that you might know. Even if you do not identify as a survivor, we're always looking for allies to help us in the work that we do. And we're always looking for different ideas and how we can reach as many survivors as we possibly can. So that was short and sweet, Kristen. So I don't know if you have any questions for me.
I feel like you covered everything, but I want to make sure that people have the chance to ask questions too if they feel like they need more information. Just to note, hopefully you've seen that we have been dropping information in the chat. So links to all the things, links to fact sheets from some of the bills I talked about that are currently still in committee from last year, links for how to sign up for our policy updates. And then also as far as the information Angie just talked about, Survivors Rising worked to put together a sort of comprehensive guide to provide some support and some framework for survivors who want to engage in policy work. And the link to that is there also. That's on the Survivors Rising website. And so please feel free to go there to check that out and to use that as needed.
Well, and we also created a fact sheet for senators. So if they are engaging with survivors and kind of what things for them to know if you're engaging with survivors, because there needs to be self-care, there needs to be a triggering response, there needs to be education on the senators part of things. I participated in the education committee, had a hearing pertaining to Title 9, I believe, or Title 10. And so there was a bunch of flyers that went up at the UNL campus, and a bunch of students came that had never spoken about their abuse, had never talked about their rape experience before. I don't even know if they've even reported them to anyone. And they showed up, and it was amazing to see the students. And it was so encouraging to see everyone that showed up to tell their story. But what happens is that if you don't understand survivors and what happens to them while they're being triggered, as a survivor, I don't need to be touched after. If I'm in a triggered position, I don't need a hug. I don't need any of that stuff. What I do need is some time to decompress and do my self-care, whatever that is, whether it's listening to music or deep breathing or having a moment to kind of reflect, or be with other survivors that kind of understand. But I don't need all of the lovey-dovey things. And that was some of the things that we were seeing, which is great. It's so good to see all of the support, but it's also like, a nice tap on the shoulder, being like, hey, if you ever need anything, here's some services, here's some places for you to gain some more support. And if you would, here's some groups that you can become a part of so that you can have conversations to help you through with your story. So all of that is super important. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen with our senators, obviously, but we did create that sheet for them also.
Yeah. And I would say, I have vivid recollections of the year when you really started engaging in policy work. And then that year in particular, it seemed like there was a lot of bills, and we saw a lot of individuals with lived experience come to testify. which was really incredible. And it's so important for senators to hear. And also it was really clear that they didn't have a lot of support before that happened. And that for some of them, it was perhaps the first time they had talked about their experience in a really public setting. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know all the things that you talked about, like people are watching you remotely as well as in the room, and there's a lot of people, and all of those things. And so I think for me that year, I came back and said, we have to do something. Like we have to make sure, like we have a responsibility to make sure that we can provide support in whatever way makes the most sense for individuals so that they can share their experience, and they can do it and feel safe and supported doing it. And so Angie's been such an incredible part of that. And I mean, I've watched her get up and leave the room and follow survivors out that showed up to testify and didn't have support with them, and walk out and have the conversation and make sure that they were okay afterwards. So just know that we so appreciate all the work that you've done in that space. What other questions do people have? I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, but we'd love to answer questions that you have or chat about anything else that maybe we didn't cover. If you have, we're wondering about something else, we can do our best to answer that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bills that we we touch a little bit on opposition bills, right? So there's also ways that we can, if we see a bill that's coming that it doesn't support survivor voice, then we can start those conversations too, to reach out to that senator, to their staff, or even to that committee that it's going to be heard of, because Nebraska is very unique. Every single bill that gets brought forward, that gets introduced in the first 10 days, is required to have a hearing. So we will all have the opportunity to go and speak pertaining to that bill. So this session may be one that we, as Survivors Rising, we are already on record for some of the bills that are already in the queue, but there are going to be some bills that we may need to think about our opposition voice for, and how those do not support survivors of violence, because we all know the statistics of the lack of reporting. There's a lot of barriers to reporting. And so our job is to take away those barriers. And so the last thing that we want is for bills to come forward that would limit survivors from reporting. And so that's kind of one of those things. So not only are we looking for bills that we would like to support, but we're also very aware of those bills that we may be opposed to. And so I know that we all took a neutral on LB 281 this past session, but there's a lot of senators that were on record saying that they supported it. And it would have made it mandatory in all the schools in the state of Nebraska. So that was the sexual sex ed. And I'm very much on record with my letters to the editor pertaining to my story. I strongly believe that we need sex education in our schools that's age appropriate, starting very early on, because it's not just the older kids that face sexual violence. I was 4 years old when I was first introduced to it. So we need to make sure that we are teaching boundaries and consent at a very early age, in body parts, because that's super important. If you talk to anyone that does a forensic analysis at Project Harmony, we need to be able to label body parts. So that's just, obviously it's all age appropriate, but it's all super important if we want to stop childhood sexual assault in the state.
So there is a question in the chat. If someone is new to advocacy work, what is the first step? And so, Angie, I'm going to let you answer that, maybe for specifically for if you have individuals with lived experience that really want to kind of step into this space. What would be the first step?
Yeah, so at Survivors Rising, we've kind of created this class. So we have some trainers that can help you formulate your story. And so it'll walk through and the different stages of how to tell your story in an effective way. So that's probably one of the first places that we like to turn survivors, is over to that group that helps formulate, put you through a training, walks you through your story. I know that I had amazing consultant from Women's Friend come to my house, and we did in-person training. So we don't do that anymore because this is prior to Survivors Rising, but it formulated it and it walked me through different parts of my life, because of the experience that I had, I would always say, well, this thing happened to me when I was 4, or this thing happened to me when I was 18. And they're like, no, you can't call it a thing. Let's put a word to it. We need to actually label what this is, because the second that you start to diminish your story, you're also diminishing everyone else's story that happened to. So we need to make sure that we are telling your story with the accurate terminology, the accurate words. And it made me become a lot stronger in my story and owning my story, because the last thing you want is for your story to own you. So the second that you take ownership of what happened to you and be able to label those things that actually happened to you and call them by what they were, then that gives you the ownership and gives you the freedom to be able to tell that story. So it's made me more comfortable to go down to the legislature and say that the first time I was raped, I was 4 years old. And so being able to talk to a room full of strangers and the Judiciary Committee and this big giant room and be able to own that, because that's my story, because I'm an expert on my story. So whenever I talk to a survivor, I like to reiterate to them that you are the expert on your story. So that don't let anyone take your power away from you. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Be able to learn that. So please, yes, send people to Survivors Rising. We have a group, we have some trainers that will help pull that story out. And there's a lot of bills that I testify on across many different hearings. You'd be shocked at how your story is so impactful on so many bills, because there's different little pieces of your story that's super important, that would help thousands of people within the state.
And I would echo all of that and just add that, we have folks that call us fairly regularly just because they've seen our name somewhere, and that they know that we do policy work around these issues. And so sometimes they'll reach out to senators, who the senators will connect them to us. Sometimes they just cold call us. That's really how we've gotten engaged with some of the families of homicide victims, domestic violence homicides that have just reached out to us and wanted to start conversations. So we always welcome that. And again, we work closely with Survivors Rising. And so, always connect folks back to some of the training or the support that they provide around people coming into that work also.
Well, and I would like to add on something that I haven't talked about. I touched on a little bit, but I'm 30 years post-crisis. So I am well into, I'm in a really safe place. And that's where I'm at today. And I didn't want to start talking about my story until like 5 years ago, 6 years. It was back in 2016 when I started telling my story. So I was, 25 years post-crisis before I was ready. I run into survivors now that are only 1 or 2 years or 3 years post-crisis. And I don't have that. I never had that strength to be able to do that. So I always commend survivors if they're able to start advocating for themselves just out of being in crisis. But the only thing that I would say was just, listen to your body, listen to how you're reacting. There's a lot of survivors, even myself, after I tell a story or after someone approaches me to ask about my story, that I still get triggered. And just having that knowledge that no matter where you're at in your survivorship, you can still have those feelings of insecurity or not feeling safe. So sometimes we do have survivors that come and they want to say, I'm here, I want to tell my story, I want to get it out. And then it doesn't work for them right then. But forgiveness and grace for everyone that wants to tell their story. But it's okay to take a step back too and say, okay, maybe now's not the right time to be able to be out, because we want to make sure that everyone feels safe and secure in where they're at and how they're telling the story, and that they're telling the story in the way that they feel the most comfortable. So whatever medium that is, obviously we do it where there's ways that we can submit letters that are anonymous. for hearings so that your personal information is not out there if that doesn't make you feel comfortable. So there are ways that people can participate if they're not ready to completely come out with their story too.
Thank you for naming that. That's super important. I want folks to know that there are lots of different ways to engage and they all look different, right? And it's really about where they're at, what they're comfortable with, how they want to engage, all of those things. It doesn't have to mean that they just show up to hearings and testify. It could be working with the people writing the bills. It could be just chatting with us. It could be maybe meeting one-on-one with senators. It could even be looking at bills and saying, like, here's some unintended consequences I think you may not be thinking about. Like, in my experience, these things would have been really important. We work closely with survivors in a lot of different ways around policy work. And so it can look a lot of different ways. So I thank you for naming that. I appreciate that. All right. Does anyone else have questions before we wrap up and let you get back on or let you get on with the rest of your Friday? No?